This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. My name is Winifred Lewis. I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hey guys, I'm Austin Manchotti and I'm a research assistant on this project.
Hi, I'm Serena Camior and I'm a student at UQ.
And what we're doing is making introductory videos about the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And today we are recording for Chapter 11, Anti-Nuclear Movements in the US, Europe, and Asia. It's written by Helena Flamm and Hiroshi Honda. And Professor Flamm is a sociologist at, my notes are going up. Professor Flamm is a sociologist at the University of Leipzig, and Professor Honda is in political science at Hokai Gakuin University in Sapporo. I guess the title gives away the reality that there's a heap of different protests in different countries and regions, Austin?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things the chapter does quite nicely is it goes through quite a few big countries like America, Europe, and parts of Asia, and it lists some of the accidents and some of the bigger movements. So I'll give a few examples actually. Sure, we'll start with the US because that's where the chapter starts. In 1982, for instance, the largest US and worldwide anti-nuclear protest took place. About 1 million people demonstrated in New York City against nuclear weapons and, to end the Cold War arms race, basically, And then it lists more. It goes basically in a timeline format. And then when it goes into Europe, it talks about various countries in Europe, Sweden, France, and a few other ones. And it says like, since at least 2015, Europe is aimed at decreasing its dependence on energy imports and fossil fuels while increasing its reliance on renewables with overall, the aim of reducing carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions and contributing to a better climate. And then moves into Asia and it's split up into Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So like for Japan, for instance, right, it came to have the third largest capacity of nuclear power next to the United States and France by 1985, but its atomic contribution to the electricity production never went beyond its peak of 31% in 1997. It's quite interesting, actually. And like in Taiwan, interesting, they built 6 reactors, all operated by the state-owned utility Taipower. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
And all 3 sites were built by 1985, but most of the atomic power plants were built close to the nation's capital, which is causing a lot of public concerns leading into those protests, as we spoke about before.
Yeah, and I guess part of the, I was just going to jump in. Part of the reason why there's a concern about living close to a nuclear power plant, and part of the reason why there's different timelines in different countries has been a series of high-profile accidents, right, Serena?
Yes. So the 3 incidents that gathered the most attention was in 1979, the 3 Mile Island incident where there was a leak of radioactive gases. Then that was followed by 1986, Chernobyl, where the reactors went out of control and there was an explosion which released large amounts of radiation. That was followed lastly by Fukushima in 2011, which after an earthquake caused a nuclear accident.
Yeah, and in each of these cases, there's enormous disruption with, illness and poisonings that have persisted for decades. And in the case of Fukushima, enormous financial costs and loss of life as well. But I guess even more loss of life was caused by nuclear weapons. So another theme of the chapter is that in parallel to the protests against nuclear power plants, there's also a sustained protest against nuclear weapons. And of course, that started after the post-war period because hundreds of thousands of people were killed by nuclear weapons in Japan. And around the world, people protested against that. And issues like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the US, where the world nearly went to the brink of nuclear war, mobilized public attention against this destructive weapon. And in our own chapter on Oceania, we talk about the protests against nuclear testing and nuclear weapons in the Pacific, because from the 1950s onward, it's hard to believe now, but the way that nuclear weapons were tested was literally by dropping them on Pacific islands, some inhabited. And the local communities were poisoned and the lands were poisoned. And although it was conducted in secrecy, there was an increasing protest movement that took decades before nuclear testing in the Pacific was stopped. And that's been, very important even to this day, because something that's not mentioned in the chapter, but which is very significant in the anti-nuclear weapons context, is that in 2017, after lobbying by a coalition, the International Coalition Against Nuclear Weapons, in 2017, the UN actually passed a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, and it's now been signed by 80 countries, and it's come into force legally. And it calls for compensation for victims of nuclear bombs and so on, as well as research into the lasting effects of poisoning by radiation. So those are some, important developments in that in the anti-nuclear weapon category. But of course, many states remain committed to nuclear weapons, and that has influenced the protests and the use of nuclear power around the world. Austin?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the chapter goes on to state that I think specifically France, China, and Russia have kept, expanding their nuclear power, but have also pursued nuclear weapons due to its connection to being, a player on the international stage, particularly in weapons programs and defense systems.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, that the literature just isn't there for at least China and Russia. So there's not much we can particularly say about it. But
yeah, that's something the authors highlight, is the lack of research and the gap in the research literature on the nuclear programs of China and Russia, and also their anti-nuclear protest movements, which I'm sure would have been repressed. And another kind of factor, if that's external politics, is sort of internal politics, because I think especially when it comes to disposing of nuclear waste, a lot of the questions are whether you have spaces and communities where you consider it legitimate to put radioactive dumps. Serena?
Yes. So in the same year as the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979, there was another incident called the Church Rock uranium mill spill in New Mexico. And though that sort of was a worse radioactive release, it harmed the Navajo Nation in New Mexico and a lot of communities of color. It received very little public attention.
Yeah, and even today, the name of Church Rock is almost unknown, whereas 3 Mile Island is still an accident that people have, a strong or a relatively strong understanding of. I guess for me, like this chapter, just thinking about how we can wrap up and give key points, it really is a historical analysis, a comparative historical analysis, looking at movements around the world. And there's a lot that I had no idea about, like anti-nuclear forces in Taiwan or nuclear power in Taiwan. I've just learned a lot about these areas. What about you guys, Austin? What was your reaction overall to the chapter?
I think you summed it up quite nicely. It definitely fleshes out a lot of the gray areas around nuclear movements and nuclear power. Some of these things have leaked through the media over the years, Chernobyl and the accidents in the Cold War and Hiroshima and whatnot. You hear about them in school, you grow up learning about them. But this really explains all these things happen leading up to it, and all these things happened afterwards. And it gives a much more full picture of, how dangerous or what impact nuclear power has had on the world.
Yeah. What about you, Serena? What are your thoughts?
So overall, I felt like what was most interesting was the fluctuations in the protest of each country when they ignite the protest, when they sort of slow down, and how that maps onto the different historical events.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it really highlights, in some cases, the protesters slowed down because they won. So they actually had bans introduced or plans to phase out nuclear power, which really slowed the anti-nuclear protests. But an interesting point that the author makes that we see in history is that these phase out plans, even when they're implemented or a ban comes into effect, takes a long time to enforce it. And there's been a lot of delays, especially because of the tension within many countries between wanting to close their nuclear power plants and wanting to close their coal power plants and the need for energy. There's been sometimes real difficulty in following through once there's been a political commitment to end nuclear power. So yeah, I think that's probably a good place to leave it, that it's an ongoing area of difficulty and confusion. But yeah, I'll just close by thanking you, Austin and Serena, for being part of the recording process. And I'll say thanks to our viewers as well, if you're here with us to the end of the recording. Bye now.
Like,
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.